caused them so much trouble 2 nights before. Moreover, the landing area was adjacent to a 60-kilometre stretch of coastline densely packed with anti-aircraft guns, but anti-aircraft artillery on ships and on land was ordered not to open fire. P-47 planes were to go over the coast at a low altitude of 200 metres. That evening, shortly after dark, German aviation again raided. From the gloomy room of the Carabinieri headquarters, we saw in the sky flashes of bursting anti-aircraft shells. Hardly had the enemy dropped bombs and quieted anti-aircraft guns, as we heard the sound of the engines of the first Echelon transport planes, following at low altitude over the bay and turning to the landing area. It was a cloudless Mediterranean night, and not the slightest breeze was felt. Moonlight shimmered in the waves, and the ships stood motionless in the bay after the turmoil caused by the German air raid. The first transport planes had passed the coast at exactly the right time, and the noise of their engines was hushed in the direction of Gela. Suddenly, in the tense silence, a lone anti-aircraft gun shot sounded. As I watched helplessly from the Scoglietti, the sky above us erupted with the bursts of anti-aircraft shells. Soon shrapnel rattled the tiled roof of our building. Like a flock of frightened quail, the formation of airplanes scattered in different directions. Pilots tried to save their machines. Lights flashed in the darkened cockpits, and paratroopers began to eject from their cars. Some landed near the location of our divisions. They were mistaken for Germans and opened fire on them while they were still swinging on the slings of their parachutes. Of the 144 airplanes that participated in the airborne ejection, 23 machines did not return. Half of the surviving planes, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, barely made it to Tunisia. In the morning we saw a sad picture, the remains of downed planes sticking out of the water. The paratroopers had lost more than 20% of their personnel. Although I considered the main culprit of the tragedy of the fleet due to the lack of fire discipline, but did not forget that anti-aircraft guns on the shore also included in the firing. Whether it was the ship's anti-aircraft gunners or the land-based anti-aircraft gunners who opened fire first and caused the carnage has never been established. However, the sailors were already well known for the ease with which they pulled the trigger. This was revealed on the very first day of the landing, when the ships were repeatedly bombarded by Allied aircraft. The Navy even managed to fire on its own fire adjustment. Anti-aircraft gunners later claimed that the German planes turned back and attached themselves to the tail of our transport planes for another surprise attack on our ships. While this report was believed by many, it was never confirmed or disproved. The fleet's nervousness was later explained by an officer on Admiral Cunningham's staff. "Keep in mind, gentlemen," he said, addressing the officers of the headquarters of the airborne forces, that so far every plane that has appeared over our ships in the Mediterranean Sea was the enemy. And although the Navy is now in a period of transition, it is still extremely difficult to convince the trigger-happy youngsters that such a thing as their planes appearing in the air over our ships is a very real thing. As a result of this tragedy in Sicily, the Air Force Command bitterly stated that the only way to avoid being fired by the ship's anti-aircraft artillery of their aircraft is to stay as far away from the ships as possible. Thereafter, when organizing airborne operations, we diligently bypassed our fleet. Sicilian campaign consisted of several separate stages, the first of which was the landing of the Allies on the coast of the island, and the last final stage, the capture of the port of the enemy, Messina, through which he evacuated his troops on the Apennine Peninsula, before the invasion of Sicily was planned, only landing on the coast. Further leadership of operations was to be carried out by the group of armies of Alexander. After securing the bridgehead, the Second Corps was to move deep into the island and occupy 3 strategic enemy airfields that were in the Corps' offensive strip. The Corps then continued to advance until it reached the Vicini, Caltagirone highway, running parallel to the Gulf Coast at a distance of approximately 40 kilometers. This road was the yellow line to which our troops were to advance. Riding this road, the Second Corps created a strong position for the development of the offensive to the north. The Vicini, Caltagirone Road was one of the important highways that stretched from the coast of Sicily to the central part of the island to the fortified road junction at Enna. This road was also the main route of approach to the road junction from the southeastern part of the island where we landed. I subsequently learned that this fact had not escaped the attention of General Montgomery with his keen sense of tactical maneuver. On the afternoon of July 11, the 45th Division occupied the first of 3 designated airfields in the Comiso area. 25 enemy planes were captured at the airfield, with the remains of over 100 planes lying around the airfield. I quickly dispatched an anti-aircraft artillery division to Comiso to cover the airfield from enemy air attacks, while work was being done to convert it into an American airbase. The first to land on the field after the airfield was captured was a twin-engine medium German U-88 bomber. When the airplane released its landing gear and began to come in for a landing, our anti-aircraft gunners opened fire and missed. As the plane approached the parking lot, the pilot jumped out of the cockpit, threatening the gun crew with his fist. Only then he learned that the airfield was occupied. Then came two Messerschmitt. Our anti-aircraft gunners did not open fire and captured two more pilots. Finally, over the field flew on a shaving flight with a reconnaissance target Spitfire. This time, the confused anti-aircraft gunners fired on their plane. The next morning, a squadron of Spitfires was to be relocated to the airfield. Fearing that the Spitfires might have been fired upon, I sent Hansen to Comiso to the anti-aircraft division commander. Tell him, I told Hansen quite seriously, that if a single gun opens fire on the approach of the Spitfires, he can get away over the mountains to Messina. On July 14, we came within actual artillery fire distance of the Visini-Caltagirone road, which opened the way to Enna. On this day, Patton summoned me to 7th Army headquarters in the town of Gela. The road was clogged with a stream of oncoming vehicles from the coast, and a convoy of nurses passed us. Their faces were dirty and sweaty. I caught sight of Patton in a cloud of tobacco smoke. He was standing with the Chief of Operations, leaning over a map. We got a directive from Army Group Headquarters, Brad. Monty would advance along the road Visini, Caltagirone in order to bypass Catania and Mount Etna from the west through Enna. Therefore, you will have to withdraw the 45th Division to the west of the road. I whistle. That's going to give us a hell of a predicament. I was counting on that road. If you deny us the right to use it, our advance will be severely slowed. Originally, the disputed road was in our lane, so I wanted to use it to advance to the road junction near Enna. However, Monty has apparently come to the same conclusion. Well, can we at least use the road to move Middleton's division to Terry Allen's left flank? I asked Patton. It would be easier to move Middleton's division to the left flank than to move both divisions to the west. In that case, Terry might be able to keep up the offensive without slowing down. I'd hate to see the enemy get a foothold. Unfortunately, Brad, Patton replied, you must clear the road immediately. Monty won't wait. But a difficult position is being created for us. Middleton's division is only 1,000 yards from the road. If I cannot use the road to move this division to Allen's left flank, then I will have to pull the 45th Division all the way to the coast and bring it to a new section through the rear of Terry's troops. This would not only cause a strain on the transportation needed to supply the troops with ammunition and fuel, it also meant that we would have to stop the offensive on the front of the 2nd Corps for several days. The enemy was retreating in disarray. I did not want to give him a break. After reading Alexander's directive, I returned it to Patton with a grim look. Montgomery was to advance on Messina by two diverging roads. The first road ran along the east coast of the island through the marshes, Catania, and the narrow passage between Mount Etna and the sea. The second road passed through a junction of roads near Enna, skirting Etna to the north and out to Messina. This road gave Monty the opportunity to bypass the marshes and avoid possible congestion on the coastal road. However, to capture the road junction near Enna, he needed the disputed road through Visini. From Alexander's directive implied that the attack on Messina will be the British, and the actions of American troops Patton was limited to the western part of the island. The Germans, fearing to be trapped here, had already begun to retreat to the east. The enemy apparently intended to concentrate his troops in a narrow neck at Messina, where the terrain gave him the opportunity to delay the numerically superior Allied forces, with a port behind them through which they could evacuate at any time. The Germans could make the Allies pay dearly for every move. A total of 4 roads ran to Messina, of which only 2 approached directly to this port. One passed through Catania on the east coast of Sicily, and the other along the north coast. The other 2 roads were inland and ran from a road junction near Enna. These roads were 15 kilometers apart, with the southern road skirting Mount Etna from the west, and the northern road running parallel to the first through Nicosia and Troina. The latter road was only 25 kilometers from the seaside road along the northern coast. The 2 inland roads joined together at Randazzo on the northwestern slope of Etna. From here, one road branched off to the highway coming from Catania and the other went north. Although the road network was small, it was sufficient for the two Allied armies advancing on Messina. If Montgomery had limited his bypass manoeuvre to using the southern inland road, he could have surrounded both Catania and Mount Etna. This would have given 7th Army the opportunity to advance on Messina in two directions, the inland road through Nicosia and the northern seaside road. I hoped that Alexander would adopt just such a plan. When the road through Vizini was taken away, there was nothing left to do but put the personnel of the 45th Division on trucks, return to the coast, and from there move Middleton's division to the left flank of Allen's 1st Division. I was sure that Alexander did not know the predicament in which his directive had placed our corps. Because we did not have a road through Vizini at our disposal for at least one day, we had to move our troops from one section of the front to another with great difficulty. A few weeks later, well after the end of the campaign in Sicily, Patton visited Monty at his command post. During the conversation, George complained to him about the unfair directive of Alexander's army group, depriving us of the road Vizini, Calta. Monty looked at him with a smile. "George," he said, "let me give you some advice. If you get an order from a group of armies that you don't like, don't carry it out. That's exactly what I'm doing." Montgomery was joking, of course. He himself was a good, though sometimes stubborn soldier. He obeyed the orders he received, though at times he seemed to circumvent them while carefully concealing it. Montgomery's advice to Patton essentially reflected the usual viewpoint of British commanders, which is sometimes difficult for an American soldier to understand. Unlike the United States Army, where unconditional obedience to orders is required, the British view orders as a basis for discussion. If disagreements arise, they are taken into consideration and the order can be changed as a result. In the American Army, on the contrary, we try to ascertain all considerations before giving an order. Once an order is given, no one can change it except the commander who gave it. Had I known about this peculiarity of the British, I would surely have asked Patton to appeal to the Army Group's decision regarding the road. While we were engaged in moving the 45th Division, Patton established a provisional corps under General Keyes to clear the enemy from the western part of the island. In this hastily formed formation, Patton included the 3rd Infantry and 2nd Armoured Divisions, 2 of Ridgway's airborne regiments, and 2 battalions of Rangers. The Rangers battalions first appeared during Operation Torch, and soon earned an outstanding reputation on the Tunisian front. These battalions recruited volunteers who were not intimidated by the added hardship of the Rangers' shoulder patch. The Rangers battalions became as much a part of the U.S. Army as any other unit. The 1st Rangers Battalion was organized in the summer of 1942 by Major William Darby. Prior to that, its commanding officer, a 31-year-old major, had served at Fort Smith, Arkansas. While serving as adjutant to the commander of the 34th Infantry Division in Ireland, Darby came to the conclusion that it was necessary to create light sabotage and reconnaissance battalions capable of performing tasks beyond the capabilities of a conventional infantry battalion. The first group of volunteers was modelled after the British commandos. Darby trained his men so ruthlessly in a windswept training camp in Scotland that they were soon begging to be sent to the front and spared the grueling training exercises. In selecting volunteers for the Rangers battalions, attention was first and foremost paid to their general development and inclinations, as well as their agility and endurance. As a result of this selection, Rangers soldiers by the end of the war had acquired such fighting qualities that, in my opinion, there was not a single task they could not accomplish. During the assault on Gela, Italian tanks counterattacked Rangers battalions in the streets of the town. Darby, now a lieutenant colonel in charge of the leadership of both Rangers battalions, rushed his jeep to the coast. There he picked up and loaded a 37mm anti-tank gun into the jeep and hurried back to the city. With this improvised self-propelled launcher, he engaged the Italian tanks. Soon several tanks were hit and the rest retreated in panic. For this feat, Darby was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and similar feats worthy of being awarded. He made many. When the commander of the 45th Division asked me to appoint a new regimental commander to replace the deposed one, I asked Patton to appoint Darby. By doing so, he had the opportunity for promotion and the enviable position of regimental commander. George did not make an independent decision on Darby's transfer to the 45th Division. On the contrary, he left it to Darby to decide the matter for himself. "Therefore, General, I can choose." Asked the bald-headed Darby, smiling. However, I am not accustomed to choosing the army. Accept the regiment, and I will make you colonel in the morning, said Patton, but I don't want to force you. There are 1,000 colonels in the army, and every one of them would gladly avail himself of the opportunity. Darby looked first at me, and then at Patton. Thank you, General, he replied, but I prefer to stay with my boys. On July 16, 2 days after receiving the order to clear the Vizini Road for Montgomery's troops, Patton received a new directive from Army Group. The directive confirmed my earlier suspicions. Only Montgomery's troops were to advance on Messina. The island was divided into 2 parts, British and American. Patton directed his efforts against the western part, where there was little resistance, and the 8th Army Montgomery had the task of pushing back the Germans beyond the Straits of Messina. Patton was to establish a secure base in the central part of the island, where Caltanissetta and Enna were located. From here, the 2nd Corps was to move in 2 columns. The 1st column moved northward, toward the coastal road, and the 2nd, to the northwest, to Palermo. Casey's temporarily established corps was advancing from its bridgehead at Lacata in a north and west direction. While Patton's mission looked more impressive in terms of territory occupied, Montgomery faced a very difficult task, for the collapse of the Italian divisions and the retreat of the Germans from the western part of the island resulted in the concentration of all enemy troops in its eastern part. For Patton, full of offensive spirit and ready to pursue the enemy all the way to Messina. The limitation of activity, only the western half of the island, was a cruel disappointment. Certainly the capture of Palermo was important in securing supplies for the 7th Army, but except for this single port, there were no other facilities on the western half of the island. Clearly, there was nothing heroic about capturing undefended heights, capturing obedient peasants and fallen Italian soldiers. The next day, the command of the 15th Army Group ordered Patton to continue the offensive to the north and cut the coastal road from Palermo to Messina. And then Mo added an officer from Patton's headquarters. We can sit quietly on the suitcases and wait for Monty to finish the damn wave. It didn't turn out to be so easy, however. The 8th Army was fighting hard on the plain near Catania. By midnight on July 16, the 45th Division had liberated the Vizini, Caltagirone Road, and, marching in a circuitous route, took up positions to the left of Allen's division. At dawn the next day, Middleton immediately took the offensive. For 6 days the 45th Division advanced without rest in the central part of the island. It was one of the hardest and longest fought battles of the entire war in the Mediterranean.
As the grey cliffs of Oran remained behind the stern of the Ancona on the evening of July 5, the voice of Lieutenant John Mason Brown came over the loudspeaker.
A theatre critic, writer, and lecturer in Manhattan, Brown had been drafted into the Navy and became an officer on Admiral Kirk's staff. His duties included familiarizing the ship's crew with daily bulletins. Like any good commander, Kirk knew that soldiers perform a task with more enthusiasm if they understand it. We're heading for Sicily, Brown said. Our task is to land the division in the southeastern part of the island, near the small fishing town of Scogliti. So the crew of the Ancona was first told where their ship was headed as part of a huge Allied convoy. Behind the stern of the Ancona, the ships marched in a fan-shaped formation toward the setting sun. In the cloudless sky above each transport, a barrage balloon was tethered on a tether. Patrols of P-38 fighters covered the convoy from observation by enemy reconnaissance planes. Kirk's 96 ship convoy was one of 3 U.S. groups, carrying landing troops that together formed a huge armada for Operation Husky under the overall command of Vice Admiral Hewitt. Hewitt, as commander of the Western Naval Task Force, was on the same ship as Patton. With Patton aboard Hewitt's flagship Monrovia, the 7th Army headquarters was located aboard Hewitt's flagship. Overall command of the land and sea forces while at sea was exercised by Hewitt. Patton took command of his army only after it had come ashore. Rear Admiral John Hall, commander of the task force, assigned to land the 1st Infantry Division, codenamed Dame, was aboard the U.S. Samuel Chase. With him on the ship was Terry Allen, whose 1st Division was landing at Jala. Allen's division was reinforced by 2 battalions of Rangers aboard British landing craft, landing directly in Jala Harbour. The small numbers of these battalions were more than compensated for by their fighting spirit. Admiral Kirk, as commander of the task force formed to land the 45th Division, codenamed Saint, was on the same ship as Troy Middleton, whose 45th Division landed at sites east and west of Scoglietti, unlike the other two U.S. task forces. This group arrived from the United States in readiness to land in combat. Immediately after the implementation of Operations Saint and Dime, the landed troops came under my command. The 3rd Task Force, intended for the landing of the 3rd Infantry Division in the area of Licata-Tatilly, was headed by Rear Admiral Richard Connolly. He was on the same ship as General Truscott. Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division, reinforced by tanks of the 2nd Armoured Division, covered the troops of the 2nd Corps, landing on the beachhead from enemy counterattacks from the west. Troops destined to land at the Dime and Saint sections were loaded onto ocean-going ships at Algiers and R&D. Troops landing at the Jos site were loaded at Bizerti and other Tunisian ports, directly onto landing craft and proceeded immediately through the Straits of Tunis to the landing sites. The Allies assembled a total of more than 3,200 ships. This was by then the largest concentration of naval forces during World War II. Nearly 2,000 ships were to take part in the landing of 1st Echelon troops in southern Sicily. To cover the landing from the unlikely attack of the Italian Navy's surface ships, the British formed 2 strike groups from parts of the large ships of their Mediterranean fleet. The first group, called Group H, was concentrated in the Ionian Sea, in the area south of the heel of the Italian boot. This group not only covered the landing of the Montgomery, landing carried out by the Eastern Task Force of the Allied naval forces, but the day before the landing was to conduct a demonstrative maneuver in the direction of Greece to mislead the enemy about the true intentions of the Allies. In the western part of the Mediterranean Sea area of the landing of American troops covered from a possible attack of the Italian fleet, Combat Group CE, a squadron of British line ships. At first, this group was assigned the task of preventing the approach of enemy naval forces to Sicily from the Tyrrhenian Sea, and then a demonstration against the western part of Sicily to try to divert there the enemy reserves in order to weaken his resistance to the invasion area. On the 2nd day at sea, I stood on the bridge and watched the radar screen. Pulses began to flicker on the screen. Apparently, a convoy from England, explained to me the duty officer, having checked the map. The 1st Canadian Division had sailed from England in constant readiness for a combat landing. It covered a distance of 5,800 kilometres to join the British troops landing in Montgomery's section of the 8th Army. Montgomery experienced even greater difficulties than Patton in concentrating his huge forces. American troops were loaded at only 3 ports, Oran, Algiers, and Bizerte. Montgomery's ports of embarkation, on the other hand, were scattered along the entire route. Benghazi, Alexandria, Port Said, Haifa, and Beirut. Preparing for the invasion, Montgomery's troops conducted training landings even on the Red Sea coast. The Allied shipping plan called for Admiral Kirk and Hall's eastbound convoys, as well as the Canadian Division from England, to follow the coast of North Africa, then pass through the Straits of Tunisia as if heading the usual route to Malta. After turning south beyond Cape Bon to give the enemy the impression that we were heading for Greece or even Crete, our ships would turn north at nightfall and, passing Malta, approach the coast of Sicily. By noon on July 8, we could see the ruins of Bizerte as we were in the narrowest part of the Mediterranean between North Africa and Sicily. We expected an attack by German fighters from airfields in Sicily, but there was no sign of us being sighted all day. I concluded that the enemy might be using his air force to launch a massive attack when we approached the coast. While still at sea, Admiral Kirk received a radio report of the results of the latest submarine reconnaissance of the 45th Division landing site. The report indicated that the landing craft can sit on sandbanks hidden underwater. However, earlier intelligence reported, I said, that we can count on a depth of at least 1 metre in the area of these shoals. This depth is quite enough for the unimpeded passage of infantry landing craft. If we ground the ships, then, to reach the shore, we will not only have to wade in the water for a distance of hundreds of metres, but also to overcome some places, the depth of water in which reaches 1.5 metres. We're going to have a hell of a hard time landing. Kirk scrutinised his charts. There's not much to offer here, he remarked, but there's one thing we can do. We'll round up all the inflatable landing boats and supply them to the 1st Echelon. If the landing craft gets stuck on the shoals, the soldiers will row the boats to shore. The boats could certainly help, but they didn't solve the problem. Shoals would slow the concentration of forces on the coast during the first critical hours of the landing. That evening I went to bed feeling deeply uneasy. When I awoke on the morning of July 9, the Ancon, which had a displacement of 10,000 tons, was rocking violently on the waves. I went on deck and found Kirk pacing back and forth on the bridge. He was wearing a black waterproof coat. By evening, the wind had reached a speed of 55 kilometers per hour. Small infantry landing craft with thin sides, walking side by side with the Ancon, cracked at all seams, burying their bows in the white crests of huge waves. The aerostats of the barrage darted frantically over the vessels from side to side, and when the cables broke, they one by one disappeared from sight. The great danger of landing in such stormy weather caused me increasing anxiety, but I imagined that the execution of the invasion had gone so far that it could not be called off, even at the risk of failure. The plan had become the master of the situation, and nothing could delay its realization any longer.
When that ominous day was over and night had fallen, the convoys turned northward, past Malta, and, driven by the wind, headed for the coast of Sicily. I stood on the bridge, and under the howling of the wind in the spar, with fear awaited any minute now for a radiogram to cancel the airborne landing. The wind speed limit for safe ejection of parachutists should not exceed 32 kilometers. As darkness fell, the wind speed reached 65 kilometers per hour. Cancelling the airborne paratroopers, of course, not necessarily doomed to failure of our operation, but in this case we were deprived of one of the main means to repel enemy counterattack. The last thing we expected was that the Mediterranean Sea will play out a storm.
Shortly before midnight, as if hearing our prayers, the wind suddenly died down and the sea calmed down. Although the stormy weather frightened us terribly, it helped to ensure the suddenness of the landing. Nazi reconnaissance planes did not dare to fly out in such weather, and the enemy divisions on the coast relaxed vigilance, believing that we do not risk going out to sea. The storm even eliminated the danger of landing craft landing on the shoals. Large waves lifted our ships over the shoals, and Kirk's inflatable landing boats were never needed.
The vagaries of the weather, however, cost the airborne troops dearly. 4 battalions of the 82nd Airborne Division, totalling 2,700 paratroopers, were supposed to land near Jailer and take the heights inland where Terry Allen's division was landing. Instead, the paratroopers found themselves scattered over a 100-kilometre stretch, that is, almost the entire length of the Army's invasion area. For more than a week after the ejection, the paratroopers lost their bearings and losses, however, were mainly only among the paratroopers. Of the 226 airplanes involved in the ejection of the paratroopers, only 6 machines did not return to their bases.
The wind had blown the C-47s off course long before their last turn over Malta before entering the drop zone. But this great dispersion of the paratroopers cannot be attributed solely to bad weather in the Mediterranean. Part of the blame should be placed on the Transport Aviation Command, which entrusted such a difficult task to the inadequately trained crews of P-47 aircraft. They were ordered to fly at night along a difficult route over water, with inexperienced navigators having very little guidance to set a course. The operation was so difficult that even now Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who commanded the 82nd Division during the war, claims that we never learned how to eject airborne troops according to plan in the last war. He believes that this was due to some extent to inadequate joint training of transport airplane crews and airborne troops. The problem of joint training had consistently been a weakness since the organization of the 1st Airborne Division. This problem was never resolved until the end of the war. The dispersal of airborne troops over a large area played a positive role to some extent. When American paratroopers were scattered throughout the invasion area, the enemy was confused, greatly exaggerating our forces. Individual units of paratroopers prowled villages, destroyed bridges, and disrupted enemy communications. Later Patton said that, despite the failure, the airborne landing allowed us to go on the offensive from the captured bridgehead 2 days earlier than we had planned.
The airborne landing at the invasion site of Montgomery's army was even more unsuccessful. The British loaded 1,600 soldiers of the 1st Airborne Division onto 133 gliders. Only 12 gliders landed near their intended target, a bridge over a canal south of Syracuse. 47 gliders fell into the sea, and the rest made landings in different areas of the island. The bridge broke through to 8 officers and 65 soldiers, of whom by the time the vanguard of Montgomery's Marine landing party came to their aid in the afternoon after the landing, only 4 officers and 15 soldiers remained. This platoon withstood all attacks by an enemy infantry battalion reinforced with artillery and mortars.
The rocking of the Ancona gave me a slight attack of seasickness, but I forced myself to sleep for a few hours and returned to the bridge at midnight. By this time Kirk, with remarkable skill, had assembled his numerous convoy into Gila Bay, which had a semicircular ship. The enemy had not discovered us. I endeavoured to keep out of Kirk's way, as I could do nothing to help. During the first few hours of the invasion, no matter what happened, I had no opportunity to control the troops ashore. Until the division commanders came ashore and communications were established with them, we had nothing to do but lie in our bunks aboard the Ancona, handing our fate over to God and the plan. Above the shore, in the depths of which the fires of our aerial bombardment were blazing, a searchlight suddenly cut through the darkness. The beam slid across the water and disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Dozens of fingers on all the ships loosened the pressure on the triggers. The enemy had not yet spotted us and, lacking radar equipment, could not detect the convoy in the darkness. Once more the searchlight beam slid nervously across Gila Bay. For a moment the Ancon seemed fully illuminated. Then for some unknown reason the light faded and disappeared. The landing was scheduled to begin at 2:45 a.m., just after moonset when the tide was at its highest. At last that moment came, and the ships, as if unable to hold their breath any longer, opened fire. Sparks blazed in the sky, and 2 tongues of fire rose lazily above the convoy. As they descended, their motion accelerated, and they simultaneously flashed dazzlingly. A few seconds later, the heavy rumble of explosions reached the ships. As dawn broke, Ancon began to receive sketchy reports of the beginning of the landing. The 1st Division landed exactly as planned. However, large waves on the open stretch of coast made it difficult for the 45th Division to land. The troops met very little resistance everywhere except at Gela, where the Rangers battalions, who bravely landed right on the waterfront, ran into a small group of Italian tanks. When dawn broke and the entire coast and the Purple Heights inland became visible, we set up air surveillance, expecting enemy aircraft to appear. However, instead of German planes over us, with a piercing whistle flew several thick-winged Spitfires. German aviation ventured to appear over the coast much later. However, even then, the German fighters acted in pairs, quickly struck and promptly disappeared. Just a few days ago, the German Air Force missed a favourable opportunity to strike at our convoys with invasion troops when they, like ducks, stretched across the Strait of Tunis. Now off the coast at the roadstead stood thousands of ships, landing troops. But the enemy still refrained from a decisive airstrike. Either the Germans wanted to strike unexpectedly, or their situation was much worse than we thought. Only during the operation we learned how effective were the actions of the Allied air forces before the invasion. The landing of the 1st and 45th Divisions was supported by shipboard artillery, whose fire adjustments were made by radio. Fire control teams with portable radio transmitters not only landed with the 1st Echelon of infantry, but were parachuted in with airborne units of the 82nd Division. It was not until the day after the landing that we learned what an important role shipboard artillery played in the success of the operation. If there had been no fire support from the ships, the enemy could have thrown the 1st Division into the sea, organizing the defense of the coast of Sicily. The enemy could not concentrate on its entire length of sufficient forces, for no matter how powerful the coastal fortifications, the attacker from the sea can concentrate its forces against any selected section of the coast for landing. Knowing this, the enemy covered the coast with a small force of third-rate Italian coastal defence divisions. We did not count on serious resistance and really did not meet any difficulties in landing the landing force. The real threat awaited us in the interior of the island, where the enemy concentrated as a reserve of its mobile field divisions. In front of the 2nd Corps was a division Hermann Göring, ready to move into a decisive counterattack. I thought it was necessary to organize the leadership of the Battle of the Corps before the enemy went into counterattack. On the morning of the day after the landing, I left the flagship Kirk and on the infantry landing ship headed for the coast, transferring from that vessel to an amphibious vehicle that was passing by. We set course for Scoglietti. The headquarters of the 2nd Corps deployed its first command post in the cramped and damp Carabinieri headquarters left by the enemy. The castle we had furnished as our headquarters on the map before leaving Relisen was still in German hands. The 2.5-ton amphibious vehicle, which we wanted to use as a mobile communications centre, had not yet arrived in Skogliti. As we were coming ashore from Ancona, the lieutenant liaison officer noticed a jeep with a radio rig abandoned off the coast when we landed. Using a bulldozer, we pulled the jeep out of the water, hitched it to a truck, and towed it to Skogliti, where the lieutenant set about repairing the radio set. To the west, in the 1st Division sector, I heard a gun cannonade too heavy and continuous to be explained by a planned offensive. "How long will it take you to repair to establish communication with the 1st Division?" I asked the communications lieutenant. "An hour or so, sir, maybe more. I'll have to look in Skoglietti for a soldering iron." "Bill," I said to Keane, "I'm going over Terry Allen's. It's very noisy there. Maybe he's in trouble. But you may not be able to get along the coast, so wouldn't you rather go by boat?" "Thank you," I said. "I'll pick up an amphibious vehicle somewhere on the shore." The morning after landing on the shore is usually an unsightly scene. Our landing was no exception. More than 200 landing craft were stuck on the shoals, not reaching the shore. Bulldozers, blasting the soft sand, dragged the drags with cargo away from the water behind grassy dunes, where the loads were piled up. More than 700 amphibious vehicles whizzed between the ships and the shore, hauling cargo. Everywhere along the 25-kilometre coastline to Jela, lifebelts abandoned by soldiers after landing were lying on the sand. Deep along the coast, anti-aircraft gun crews buried themselves in the ground, waiting for enemy bombardment at night. Near Jela, the 1st Division fought a life-or-death battle with enemy tanks, almost breaking through to the coast. 3 months earlier, Patton persuaded Eisenhower to send to Sicily. Instead of the 36th Division, was in battle 1st Division. Perhaps by doing so he saved the 2nd Corps from a major defeat. As we expected, the most capable tank division Hermann Göring went on a counterattack along the road to Geleu, trying to throw Allen's division into the sea. I doubt any other American division could stop the tanks and prevent them from breaking through to the coast. Only the wayward 1st Division, with its equally wayward commander, was solid and experienced enough to repel the tank attack. A less experienced division could easily have panicked and seriously jeopardized the success of the landing. Tired as a dog, Terry Allen was waiting for me at his temporary command post near the shore. His eyes were red from sleeplessness and his hair was mussed. The division was still fighting off a strong enemy counterattack. "Yes. How are you doing, Terry?" I asked. "I think so," he replied, "but they're squeezing the hell out of us." He briefly told me how the enemy counterattack began. On July 11 at 6 o'clock, 40 a.m. Roosevelt reported by telephone from the 26th Regiment that German tanks had broken through in that area and were moving toward the coast. "We're going to have a hell of a time holding them off," he said, "unless we get anti-tank assets." Allen's artillery and anti-tank guns were still being unloaded ashore from landing craft. Even the anti-tank batteries of the infantry regiments had not yet been put on alert. Meanwhile, German tanks had already crumpled the infantry of the 1st Division, which had only small arms. There were reports that 20 T4 tanks were moving along the road to Jalu, where the coast was littered with supplies. Another 40 tanks broke through Allen's front and rushed toward Jela. If these tank columns joined up and reached the sea, Allen's infantry would be cut off, and the entire bridgehead would be jeopardized. Allen desperately needed artillery to stop the enemy tanks. He ordered all the division's guns to set up and fire at the enemy tanks at direct fire. Trucks rushed to the shore, where they picked up the guns in tow as soon as they were unloaded from the landing crafts. At the same time, fire control teams called in the fire of the ship's artillery. Although the German tanks passed through the fighting order of Allen's infantry, it did not pull back. The soldiers sitting in the trenches let the tanks pass and prepared to repel the grenadiers moving behind the tanks. Fortunately, the use of all the artillery helped the troops hold off the onslaught of tanks, and they were stopped on the flat ground at Jela. Of the 60 tanks involved in the counterattack, more than half were destroyed. Later that day, the enemy renewed the counterattack, though with fewer tanks. However, when the ship's artillery salvo after salvo began to put the tanks out of action, the German commanders came to the prudent conclusion that their 26-ton tanks, T4, cannot compete with the artillery of cruisers. The enemy turned back and took cover behind heights where the ship's artillery could not reach them. Allen, however, was a hair's breadth away. The tanks came within 2,000 metres of the shore before turning back. In other areas, the Allied forces only in some places met resistance from demoralised Italian coastal defence units and suffered very few losses. Divisions of the enemy's coastal defences scattered in the mountains, and soon our camps began to receive prisoners who preferred to seek refuge in the American army than to fight alongside their German allies. After landing, we had only to entrench ourselves on the bridgeheads and developed further success. That same day, as we were returning by amphibious vehicle to Scoglietti, we were called out by a soldier wearing an exorbitantly large helmet. "Look out, General," he said. "There's a German sniper hiding in the town." Thank you, son," I replied. With a carbine under my arm, I went to the town square. Several hundred Italian prisoners were gathered there. They were facing the wall, guarded by military police. Around the square, a dozen soldiers were in the entrances of houses, watching the windows carefully, waiting for a sniper to reveal himself with a shot. I approached the captain in charge of searching the prisoners and handed my carbine to Hansen. He casually released the safety and pulled the trigger. A shot rang out above my head. Someone shouted, and the soldiers rushed to the ground. Hansen was amazed at the confusion it caused. "Friend," I said, "please be careful with that damn thing." Amphibious vehicle with a radio arrived. Keane was waiting for me at the Corps command post with a telegram from Army headquarters. Assurances. Anti-aircraft artillery will not open fire in a pre-arranged strip in which the airplanes with paratroopers will. Having received these assurances, Ridgway agreed to the plan to eject the 2nd Echelon of his division. It was originally intended that the paratroopers would be dropped at nightfall on July 10, the day of the landing of the Marine landing. But since the airborne landing the day before was unsuccessful, the ejection of the 2nd Echelon was postponed for 24 hours. On the evening of July 11, 2,000 parachutists of the 82nd Division took seats in 144 C-47 aircraft at Tunisian airfields. They were to eject in the vicinity of Farello Airfield on the 1st Division site. The parachutists had little cause for concern except for the usual hazards of flying in formation at night and the risk of going off course. As for the pilots, they had more than enough to worry at. The planes were following the same zigzag course. Middleton had at his disposal only one road leading north. By bringing his regiments into the battle alternately, he was able to continue the relentless advance day, and even the enemy, who was constantly under heavy pressure, could not conceal his admiration for the exhausting pace of Middleton's troops. Dixon delivered to me a letter found in the possession of a dead German. It was addressed to his brother on the Russian front. "These marvellous Americans," the letter said, "are fighting both day and night without ceasing fire." One day, as I was driving from the Corps command post at Pietraperzia to the 45th Division, I picked up a soldier standing in the car on the road headed for the front. He was from the 82nd Airborne Division. "Where are you headed?" I asked. To my unit, sir." "But the 82nd Division is on the other side of the island." "Yes, sir," he replied, "but I landed at the 45th Division's location and decided to stay with it." I smiled involuntarily. "Where are you coming from now?" "From the hospital, sir. I ran away on my own, not wanting to undergo the long procedure of medical examination. Otherwise, I'd never have gotten back to my unit." "Wounded?" "Yes, just a scratch. I was treated at the hospital." "Did you know that you were probably reported missing by the 82nd Division when you failed to report to the assembly area after the jump? Perhaps your family is now worried about you?" He shrugged. "Give me your name," I said, "and I'll instruct you to be removed from the missing persons list." I forwarded his information to the Corps Personnel Office. In the week after the invasion, Patton's 7th Army took 22,000 prisoners, of whom a quarter were natives of Sicily mobilized into the Italian army. Guarding and housing this huge mass of hungry men became more difficult every day. They were to be evacuated by sea to camps in North Africa and thence to the United States. The prisoners of war were not at all discouraged by this prospect. On the hillsides of Sicily the crops were ripening, but there was not enough labour to harvest them. The villages had long since been taken from the villagers, all except the old men, old women, and children. We sent Sicilian prisoners of war to camps, and thus deprived their families of labour for the harvest. Without the harvest, the people of Sicily would probably have been dependent on the United States. This would have placed an additional burden on the Allied merchant fleet. To bring the matter to this point was pointless. On the third night after the landing, Dixon reported that an Italian soldier in civilian clothes had been apprehended near the Corps command post. Not a spy, I hope. No, sir. He doesn't look like one. He's just a poor peasant scared out of his wits. He told us he was on vacation in the village when the Americans came and wanted to stay home. We have no right to blame him for that, I said. Oh, of course not. There are probably thousands of soldiers who would be happy to switch places with him. They don't care about the war. They just like to get home and get back to work. Then why do we keep them in camps? Kill me, General, if I know why. Monk, imagine what would happen if we spread the rumour that every Sicilian soldier, if he deserted, could go home. Then we'd have no reason to take them prisoner. I'll get right on it, sir. We can spread the rumour through the locals. See how quickly it spreads through the vineyards. I informed the 7th Army, but when higher headquarters found out, they refused to approve our plan. But by this time it was too late to put an end to the rising tide of deserters who believed the rumours. When we stormed into Caltanissetta on July 18, Monk Dixon went to the local bishop to ask for our help. Soon everyone learned of our offer, and thousands of exhausted Sicilians came out of their hiding places. Our friendly actions caused the Sicilians to welcome us into their homes. Finally, the higher authorities agreed to our proposals for the release of prisoners of war, and on July 28 we were officially authorized to release on parole the Sicilian natives taken prisoner. Of the 122,000 taken prisoner by the American Army, 33,000 were Sicilians released on parole to their towns and villages. In every town we entered, fascist slogans were scraped off the walls and Mussolini's face was plastered on posters. Angry mobs smashed the offices of the fascist party, drove the functionaries out of town and burned the archives. At the head of the column of Montgomery's troops advancing in the centre of the neck, at Messina was the 1st Canadian Division of General Oliver Lee's 30th British Corps. The gaunt, tanned Canadians in khaki-coloured shorts and flat steel helmets were to capture the fortress city of Enna. South of Enna, Lee's troops encountered Germans entrenched in the mountains and defending a fortified town. The attack on the town was repulsed. Then Fox tried to bypass Enna from the right along a country road, since the main roads from Enna went to my uncovered rear, where there were field depots. I could not remain indifferent to the fact that with his manoeuvre Lies exposed my right flank. I did not want to expose myself to the risk of allowing the enemy to raid my rear, and so I wrote to Lee. I have just learned that you have decided to bypass Enna on the right, leaving my flank exposed. We are therefore taking the offensive on Enna, although the town is in your lane. I believe we have the right to use any road in your lane for this purpose. Lees replied so promptly and with such apologies that I regretted the harsh tone of my letter. Lees believed that his headquarters had informed me of the intentions of the British. He authorized me to use any road that might be necessary for the offensive, or to convince us that no one intended to offend the Americans. Lee sent us 2 bottles of Scotch whisky along with the letter. When Lees visited us a few days later at the luxurious palace at Caltanissetta, we repaid him by serving him tea in china cups bearing the coat of arms of the Savoy dynasty. Early in the morning 2 regiments of the 1st Division went to assault Enna from the south and west. The Germans, fearing to be surrounded in this mountain fortress, withdrew to the north. By 9 a.m. our troops had entered the ancient city surrounded by walls. Not bad, commented Dixon, not bad at all. The Saracens besieged Enna for 20 years. It only took our guys 5 hours to capture the city. In the evening, the BBC reported that British troops, making a remarkable advance northward, had taken. We were advancing with fighting through the central part of the island to the north coast. Meanwhile, Montgomery's 8th Army was halted by the enemy in front of Catania on the road to Messina. There, in the sweltering malarial swamps, stretching from the mountains to the coast, the path of Montgomery's troops, blocked by Tanks Division Hermann Goering, trying to prevent the British to airfields in the area of Garbini. Montgomery could not overcome enemy resistance on the coastal road, so he moved some of his forces to the site of Oliver Lee's to conduct a bypass manoeuvre through the central part of the island. On July 17, Patton went to Alexander with a proposal for the joint use of the American 7th and British 8th Armies against Messina. We all, after the transfer of the Vizini-Caltagirone road to Montgomery's disposal, shared Patton's opinion, which was briefly summarized as follows. In the direction against Messina, there was enough space for both Allied armies to operate. The 4 roads to Messina could easily be distributed between 2 parallel directions, allocating to each army 2 roads. To break through the enemy's defensive line in this narrow area required the striking power of both armies. One Montgomery such a task was clearly not possible. Patton's visit to the headquarters of the Army Group was just in time. On the morning of July 18, despite the release of airborne landing and landing troops from the sea, failed last General Offensive Montgomery to break through the enemy's front at Titania. Montgomery did not want to waste any more time and effort on a front that had stabilized and moved troops to Fox's section for an offensive in the central part of the island. By this time, Alexander was beginning to realize that Montgomery had taken on an impossible task in trying to advance on Messina. A telegram dated July 20 confirmed Alexander's change of heart. The 7th Army was to turn east and advance in conjunction with Montgomery's 8th Army on Messina. Both armies were now advancing on the Isthmus of Messina, which was of great strategic importance, from 2 directions, Montgomery from the south, Patton from the west, with the task of pushing back the enemy beyond the strait. The 2nd Corps was on the right flank of Patton's army, so we had to change the direction of our movement. Having reached the northern coastal road and thus isolated the eastern part of the island from the western, the corps turned eastward, advancing along 2 parallel roads, the northern coastal road and the Nicosia-Troina road. The offensive began with reconnaissance. First, according to Alexander's directive, we were to reconnoitre both routes, sending forward strong reconnaissance detachments. Then, if the situation permitted, we were to support them with a large force. Meanwhile, the 45th Division was advancing rapidly to the northwest, overcoming weakening enemy resistance. In the afternoon of July 22, its sentries showed up on the outskirts of Palermo. By this time, however, the 45th Division had moved beyond its line of demarcation, while Middleton's division was advancing toward Palermo. 7th Army headquarters had changed our delineation line, and the city was in the strip of Casey's corps. Although the 45th Division was denied the opportunity to capture this prize of honor, it welcomed the capture of Palermo because our supply lines from the south coast were too stretched. Logistics, however, did not improve as rapidly as we had hoped. In the weeks that followed, strong enemy resistance on the road to Messina greatly increased the consumption of ammunition, and the timely supply of ammunition was for a time in danger of being disrupted. At first, the responsibility for supplying the troops was assigned to the operational formations that landed the sea landings. However, after a week, the responsibility for the material support of troops took over the 7th Army. Having no special supply units, the Army was forced to entrust the tasks of logistical support of troops to the engineering brigade of the landing site service. This solution of the issue was unsuccessful because the engineering units designed to unload weapons and supplies ashore had absolutely no idea how to distribute and deliver cargoes to the front. In any case, they were not prepared to establish the work of warehouses that provided the 7th Army with all kinds of military supplies. Several times I appealed to Patton with a request to improve the supply of troops. However, he treated my requests as if I were making a fuss over nothing and paid no attention to my complaints. Although Patton exercised tactical leadership of the army with an iron hand, yet he remained almost indifferent to questions of its material support. In war, as Patton understood it at the time, there was little time left for the General Army Commander to deal with rearguard matters. When I was sometimes compelled to address Patton directly on supply matters, he would impatiently wave his hand away. "Let your men get in touch with my logistics chief. Now let's consider the plan of attack." To be fair to Patton and his 7th Army headquarters. However, we must not forget that this army was the first American army to engage in combat in World War II. From its failures and shortcomings of command, we learned much experience that helped us during the fighting in Normandy. On July 23, Middleton reported by radio to Corps headquarters at Caltanissetta that the 45th Division, having cut the island in 2 and intercepted the northern coastal road, had reached the Mediterranean coast. Army Group headquarters then more rigidly demanded that we carry out the original directive for an American offensive on Messina. We were ordered to advance eastward along the coastal road and the road Nicosia, Troina, Cesaro, while using the maximum forces that can be provided with material. In accordance with this directive, the 2nd Corps regrouped its troops and, having deployed the front at 90 Deg in the eastern direction, by August 1 was ready for an offensive on Messina large forces. Expecting an Allied offensive on Messina, the Germans concentrated on a narrow section of the front three divisions. The ubiquitous Hermann Göring Division occupied the eastern section of the front near Catania. The 15th Panzer Division was in the centre, and the 15th Grenadier Motorized Division settled the coastal road in the north. To cover the rest of this defensive line, called by Dixon the position at Etna, the Germans airlifted parts of the 1st Parachute Division from Italy. After moving British troops to Oliver Lee's left flank, Montgomery confined himself to holding the front on the road to Catania. Some Americans believe that Montgomery fell too quickly at Catania and thus prolonged the campaign in Sicily. Certainly, had he been able to break through along the eastern coastal road and blockade the port of Messina, the enemy might have been trapped on the island and forced to surrender. Montgomery, however, was tied to a narrow road with a towering volcano on one side and the sea on the other, and so his troops' advance could easily have been stopped by the Germans anywhere north of Catania, as it eventually was. The 45th Division was advancing on Messina along the northern coastal road, while I sent the 1st Division east along the Nicosia-Troina road. These roads ran parallel at a distance of 30 kilometers from each other, but they were separated by mountains densely covered with brush, through which there were few trails. By the end of July, as enemy resistance increased, our advance slowed. Terry Allen's infantry passed through Nicosia, but was stopped by the enemy, who had taken up defences in front of the town of Troina, located on top of the heights. The 45th Division on the northern coastal road was also stopped by the enemy, who had taken up convenient positions near the seaside village of Santo Stefano. The period of rapid advance came to an end, and we halted in front of a strong enemy defensive line near The 2nd Corps moved its command post to a sparse olive grove on a hillside northeast of Nicosia. One evening Hansen came into my trailer. I was talking to Ernie Pyle, he said, and he wanted to stay with you at the front for a couple of days and write a column or two about you in the paper. In those days I was still wary of members of the press. 32 years of service in the army under peaceful conditions had taught me to mind my own business, keep my mouth shut and stay out of the newspapers. Hey, couldn't this be avoided without offending Pyle? I asked. I feel considerably better without newspaper publicity. However, General, you have to look on the bright side, Hansen said sincerely. How many soldiers do we have in the corps? About 80,000. After all, those 80,000 men account for more than 250,000 fathers, mothers, wives, and other relatives in the United States. They are all worried about their sons and husbands on the front lines. What kind of guy is this Omar Badley? Is he taking good care of our pets? They are the American people, General, and they have a right to get an answer. Believe me, Pyle is among those who can give the right answer. I raised my hands and laughed. When you put the question that way, I can't refuse you. When does he want to start? For 3 days we did not part with Ernie Pyle. We ate breakfast together, contenting ourselves with dishes made with egg powder and soy gruel. After a meeting at headquarters, we, wearing goggles to protect our eyes from dust, would go to the divisions. In the afternoon, we would snack on the side of the road with melted cheese from the soldiers' Russian key and sticky fruit bars. And in the evening, we rinsed our dusty throats with Scotch whisky sent by Oliver Lees. On the 4th day, Pyle returned to the troops again. My friends accuse me of having sold out to the gold diggers, he said with a sad smile, as he dropped the helmet he was obliged to wear while he was with me and put on his helmet. On August 1, Patton replaced the 45th Division on the North Coastal Road with Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division. The 45th Division was to go with Clark to Italy, and preparations for this invasion required at least a month for rest, restaffing. The 3rd Division landed on the first day of the invasion at Licata, but its advance along the west coast of the island met with less difficulty than that of the 45th Division. The 3rd Division was therefore in comparatively better condition to take part in the closing battles in Sicily during the last 2 most strenuous weeks. Of course, we regretted parting with the brave 45th Division, but its replacement by the 3rd Division did not affect the combat effectiveness of the 2nd Corps. The Germans, retreating from Palermo, blocked the entrance to the port, sinking 44 ships. However, within 6 days of occupying the city, American sappers cleared the harbour passage, restoring the port's capacity to 60%. The first convoy to arrive at the harbour brought Eddy's 9th Infantry Division, which reinforced Allen's troops advancing along the road to Trieste, quite handily. Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division was moved to Africa to prepare for the invasion of Italy. Patton left the 2nd Armoured Division on the west side of the island to clear the area of the enemy. We still couldn't use Sherman tanks on the narrow roads of the isthmus in front of Messina. The enemy's defensive line, held by a small force, ran from the northern coastal road through steep heights to Troina. In the area of Troina, an important road junction, the enemy established a strong stronghold. From Troina, the defence line stretched eastward toward Adrano, where the enemy strengthened fortifications to cover the important road junction at Etna. From Adrano, the front line ran along the road that skirted Etna from the south to Catania on the seashore. Only one country road connected American troops at Troina with British troops at Adrano. Just as Adrano was the key to the enemy's defences in the Fox section, so Troina was a key point in our section of the front. If we had succeeded in breaking through at Troina and Lais at Adrano, the entire centre of the enemy's defence would collapse, and the enemy would have to hastily retreat along both coastal roads. From Nicosia to Troina led a winding gravel highway that passed through the small grey town of Cherami, located on top of a mountain. Between Cherami and Troina, the terrain sloped down to form a treeless depression that looked like a giant bowl of brown. The road along the bottom of the depression disappeared behind a ridge of low hills. At the far end of the depression, Troina stood on a mountain top like an ancient fortress, and beyond Troina was the huge crater of Mount Etna. On August 1, Terry Allen's infantry, who bravely descended into this brown bowl, was met by a strong enemy counterattack and driven back to the original line. The next morning I called Terry. "Nate's taking Troina will be harder than we expected," he said. "The Huns are fighting like devils in this area. The enemy defending Troina counted on 2 escape routes that led to the rear of this mountain position Diagram 15. One route went south towards Adrano, the other to Cesaro. If we managed to outflank the enemy and cut both roads, the enemy would either have to retreat from the main defensive position or stay there and get surrounded." Allen quickly went on the offensive to cut both roads, directing one column from the north and the other from the south to make a sweep of both flanks. Terry's command post was located in a damp and empty school building in Cherami, on the wall of which was painted the Nazi slogan, "Believe, Obey, Fight." I arrived at Terry with Garth to coordinate the interaction of artillery and aviation in the attack on Troina. A division of 155mm guns took up position behind the school, the muzzle wave shaking the shingled roof with each shot. Terry listened, smiling every time a volley interrupted our conversation. Finally, I turned to him and said, "Terry, can't you arrange for the cannons to fire past the building instead of into it?" Terry took the telephone receiver and ordered the guns to stop firing. Air support for ground troops in Sicily was still risky and unreliable. Although we had learned some lessons from the Tunisia campaign, the organization of liaison was far from perfect. Aviation liaison officers assigned to each division requested air support directly from the headquarters of the 3rd Air Defence Wing. Here the requests were taken into account and appropriate orders were sent to fighter airfields. The eavesdropping post of the 2nd Corps intercepted division requests, informing Corps headquarters. Too often, however, errors in transmitting orders and requisitions resulted in troops being left without air support. Toward the end of operations in Sicily, air support for ground units began to improve with the introduction of mobile fighter control points from the ground. Aviation liaison officers in jeeps equipped with ultra-shortwave radio sets advanced with the ground units and directed the fighters to their targets. Two-way communications enabled the pilots to alert our forward units to spotted enemy troop concentrations. When we were writing our final report on the fighting in Sicily, we concluded that this method of targeting fighter bombers deserves further study. A year later, aviation became the eyes of our army, rapidly advancing in France. Until we reached the isthmus before Messina, the 2nd Corps rarely had to resort to the help of fighters. Up to that point, the enemy had been fighting deterrent battles, rarely lingering at intermediate lines for long periods of time to avoid bombardment of positions by our aircraft. However, in the area of Etna, the enemy burrowed into the ground, offering stubborn resistance. Stabilized front created favorable conditions for bombing. During the fighting in Sicily, Allied troops were sometimes bombed by their aircraft mistaken for the enemy. We stretched fluorescent cloths over the hoods of our vehicles, but even these measures did not always save us from Allied air bombardment. One afternoon during a meeting at Terry Allen's command post, A formation of 36 planes bombarded us, forcing us to take cover. This was the third time that American planes had hit our positions, so I called Patton to instruct him to keep the planes out of the air. "But who told you they were our planes?" he asked. "Maybe they are German?" "General," I replied, shaking the dirt off my pants. "I just climbed out of the trench. It's definitely A-36. The next day, the A-36 Link attacked a column of American tanks. The tankers lit yellow smoke bombs, a prearranged signal to identify their troops. But the smoke only emboldened the dive bombers. Finally, the tankers, to defend themselves, opened fire on the planes. One of them was hit, and the pilot jumped out with a parachute. When he landed nearby and learned that he had been hit by American tanks, he was startled and confused. "Nay, didn't you, dummy?" Said the commander of the column of tanks. "Didn't you notice our yellow cognitive signal?" "Okay," exclaimed the pilot. So it was an identifying signal. For 3 days, Allen's attacks on Troina crashed against fierce enemy resistance. From a forested mountain northeast of the city, the enemy repulsed our attacks with targeted artillery fire. The enemy responded to each attack with a swift counterattack. Allen had to repel 24 counterattacks in 6 days. We reinforced Allen's division with another regiment of the 9th Infantry Division, bringing the number of American regiments on this front to 5. This regiment was assigned the task of knocking the enemy out of the mountain, from which he led a targeted artillery fire. The town of Troyne was to be bombed until the enemy capitulated, or until the town itself was wiped out. In the afternoon of August 4, I was waiting at a bend in the road on the mountain near Sarami for the heaviest air attack on the enemy during the operations in Sicily. On the other side of the valley, which was half covered with dust, 18 of our artillery divisions were firing on enemy anti-aircraft artillery positions. Over us circled 36 planes with 225-kilogram bombs. The artillery reduced fire, and the bombers rushed into an almost vertical dive. Soon Troina disappeared in a cloud of dust. By the time the second group of 36 bombers bombarded the city, it was still half hidden in a cloud of grey dust, through which the outline of the top of Mount Etna was still visible. Again the infantry rushed forward, and again the enemy held his ground by counterattacking. The next day we resumed the offensive. This time Major General Edwin House, commander of tactical aviation of Patton's army, travelled with me to Sarami to observe the aerial bombardment. The time scheduled for the strike had passed, and the aircraft did not appear. We were about to turn back in bewilderment when we heard the rumble of engines far to the south. There, high in the sky, a trio of airplanes, A-36, was returning to its airfield. "No, damn it," I exclaimed, turning to House. "Who do you think they dropped the bombs on?" "I'll be damned if I know," he said. "I guess we'd better get back to your headquarters and find out what happened." When we got back, the phone rang. It was Oliver Lees from the 30th British Corps. "What have we done that your guys dropped bombs on us?" he asked. "What did they bomb?" I moaned into the phone. "They bombed my headquarters," he said. "They bombed the whole town." By this time, the enemy was already thoroughly defeated on the front at Troina. He retreated, and our tanks moved forward. On the sunny morning of August 6, Allen's 16th Infantry Regiment climbed the steeps of Troina, overcoming the haphazard resistance of the enemy rearguard. Stunned by a week of aerial bombardment, the inhabitants crawled out of their cellars. The hot rays of the sun had already heated the mountains of rubble that cluttered the streets, and the nauseating odour of death reigned in the city. Although the bombardment had paralysed life in Troina for a time, German casualties had been light. On the morning that Allen entered the town with his 1st Division, the 39th Regiment of Manton Eddy's 9th Division entered Troina. At the head of the regiment walked its bold and eccentric commander, the tenacious Colonel Harry Flint of Johnsbury, Vermont, naked to the waist so that he would be better recognised by his soldiers. Paddy Flint wore a helmet, rifle in hand, a black silk scarf around his neck. The battle for Troina was the beginning of his brilliant but brief military career. A close friend of Patton's from their time together in the cavalry, Flint first appeared at the 2nd Corps command post at Bija, asking to be assigned to the front so that he could participate in the fighting. At the time, he was stationed at Allied headquarters in Algeria. "No, damn it, Brad," he complained. "I'm wasting my talents on the home front among all these colonels sleeping on feather beds." Shortly after the fighting in Tunisia ended, Manton Eddy asked me to pick a candidate to command the 39th Regiment who could shake it up, as it was beginning to show signs of sloppiness that made it stand out from the other regiments in the division. "We need a man of character in the 39th, Eddy said. I sent Paddy Flint to him. After landing in Sicily, Manton reported to Corps headquarters in Nicosia with Paddy Flint. The 39th Regiment was attached to Terry Allen to take part in the assault on Trina. The remaining regiments of Eddy's 9th Division were still on the road. Brad, Eddy whispered to me as Paddy walked lightly toward the operations tent to review the situation. Did you see this? He picked up Flint's helmet. On the side of the helmet, the letters AAAAO stenciled on the side of the helmet stood out clearly. What the hell does that mean? It means everything, always, everywhere, no matter what. Paddy had stenciled those letters on every goddamn helmet and every goddamn truck in his goddamn regiment. I grinned. Didn't you issue a special corps order about each unit's identifying marks? Eddy asked. Manton. I replied. I don't want to hear about anything. I don't even want to see that Paddy Flint helmet today. To cheer up his soldiers under enemy fire, Paddy sauntered along the line of his troops nonchalantly, rolling a cigarette in one hand. With his other hand, which was holding a rifle, he carelessly pointed at the enemy trenches. Hey, look at those lousy Gans. They didn't know how to shoot in the last war, and they haven't learned how to shoot in this one either. Can't even hit an old devil like me. Flint's chivalry bothered me. One day, Paddy, I said to him one day, you'll be walking along like this and you'll be killed. Then you will prove to your soldiers just what you are teaching them. That the months spent at the front had freed her from the need to obey discipline. The division also believed that it was alone among all other divisions in the U.S. Army in fully performing its military duty. To fight well as part of a corps, however, a division, while selflessly accomplishing its private task, must always keep in mind the overall task assigned to the corps. For the 1st Division, this was becoming more and more difficult every day. The division was already scheduled to participate in the invasion of Normandy. If it was destined to fight there side by side with untrained divisions in an untrained corps, then it was in dire need of a change in its command. By this time, Allen had become too much of an individualist to subject himself without resistance to the accomplishment of a common task. Under Allen's command, the 1st Division had become too arrogant and prideful. In order to save Allen from himself and to leave his excellent record untarnished, and to save the division from the pernicious influence of too much success, I decided to relieve Allen of command of this division. Only in this way did I hope to preserve the division's vast combat experience gained in the war in the Mediterranean, which would prove invaluable in the Normandy landings. In addition, a rivalry had gradually developed in the 1st Division between Terry Allen and his deputy, Ted Roosevelt. This was inevitable as a result of the joining together of two men with strong and assertive characters. I realized that Allen would be deeply offended if he had to leave the division and Roosevelt remained in his place. He might see himself as a failure rather than a victim of excessive success. For the same reason, Roosevelt's claim to undivided authority in the 1st Division would have put any new commander in an intolerable position from the start. Any successor to Allen would have been in a helpless state unless I allowed him to choose his own deputy. Roosevelt, therefore, had to go with Allen, for he also suffered from excessive patriotism for his division. In fact, the whole unpleasant situation arose from taking certain qualities to an extreme. Too much brilliance and success for the division, too strong characters, and too much attachment of the two men to their division. To inform them of my decision as delicately as possible, for I knew it would shock both of them, I summoned Allen and Roosevelt to my command post at Nicosia. On the way, they were detained by the Corps military police for uniform violations. Terry sat in the jeep next to the chauffeur, his helmet clutched between his knees, his unruly black hair fluttering in the wind. The military policeman stopped the car. He was embarrassed to see Allen's two generals' stars. Excuse me, General," said the policeman. "I've been instructed to detain anyone who follows without a helmet. My captain will give me a beating if he notices you passing without a helmet." Allen smiled, but Roosevelt interjected. "Look, friend, can't you see that this is the commander of the 1st Division, General Allen?" "Yes, sir," replied the military policeman, "and you are General Roosevelt, sir. However, I must reprimand you for wearing that knit cap as well." Ted shrugged in despair and removed his hat. "Brad," he said on his arrival at Corps headquarters, "we get along better with the Hans at the front than with your men in the rear." The news of the release from their posts came as a severe blow to both of them. To break such news to them was one of the most unpleasant duties I've had in the whole war, but I had to do it. Fortunately, both treated it as disciplined soldiers are supposed to. Allen returned to Europe with a perfectly trained 102nd Division, with which he reached Elba, and Roosevelt returned to England and earned the Medal of Honor for the Normandy landings. There, at age 56, he made the fourth landing on an enemy shore during the saddened supporters of Terry Allen, and there were many of them, condemned his removal from the post of division commander, believing that there was no reason for it. Some of them falsely attributed this fact to the quarrel between Allen and Patton. There was no ground for such suspicions. Patton may have annoyed Allen, but it was Patton who convinced Eisenhower to put Allen at his disposal to participate in the invasion of Sicily. The responsibility for removing Terry Allen from his post was mine alone. George merely agreed to my proposal. As a successor as commander of the 1st Division, we outlined Major General Clarence R. Hubner, known in the Army as a very demanding commander. Hubner had volunteered for the Army in 1910 as a private and had been commissioned an officer during World War I. He was no stranger to the Army. He was no stranger to the 1st Division, as he wore the armband with that division's number in all ranks from private to colonel. However, Hubner returned to the division and took command of it, moving from his staff job at the Pentagon, which certainly did not make his first steps after Allen's departure any easier. On the second day after Hubner took command of the division at Trainer, he ordered a division-wide purge. He then rigorously began training the troops, including formation training. Bastards resented the veterans of the division not hiding their indignation. They sent us Joni, who is hiding in the rear, to teach us to march on the very mountains in which we killed Gansov. What kind of idiocy would that son of a bitch get up to? Yet Hubner knew what he was doing. No matter how unpopular his first steps, from the beginning, he was determined to show the division that he was its master, and that while the 1st Division may have been the best division in the American Army, it was nevertheless only a part of it, a fact that the division sometimes forgot. Fortunately, he paid no attention to the hostile attitude toward him. He felt that he had had ample time to win the sympathy of the division. A more susceptible man might not have endured the strain. For it was not until a year after the Normandy invasion that Terry Allen's last supporters recognized Hubner's right to wear an armband bearing the 1st Division number. When he eventually left the division to take command of the corps, the soldiers regretted his departure almost as much as Allen's. Near the village of San Fratello on the north coast of Sicily, the Germans had established a defensive line on a 675-metre-high mountain from which the coastal road was visible. Truscott could not take this position by frontal assault, so he attempted to outflank it by loading heavy weapons and ammunition in packs onto mules. However, just as his troops moved into the mountains, they came under fire from enemy artillery in the dried-up bed of the Furiano River. The week before, when Middleton had encountered a similar defensive position at Santo Stefano, Patton and I had been exploring the possibility of bypassing the enemy's defences on the coast road by landing troops from the sea. The enemy, who would have been threatened from the rear by a landing force that would have saddled his escape routes, had to either abandon his defensive position and retreat or continue to hold it, risking encirclement and capture. However, for the landing of a naval landing to be successful, it required skillful organization of interaction between the landed troops and the troops advancing from the front. It is quite natural that if the main forces could not break through the front with the necessary speed and assist the small landing, the enemy troops in the rear would destroy the landed troops in pieces. Organizing the landing from the sea in the area of San Fratello, Patton left the delicate part of clarifying the timing of the landing for the 2nd Corps. Having ascertained from Truscott his possibilities of advancing by land, we set the landing for August 8. Early in the morning, a reinforced battalion of infantry landed, without encountering resistance, at Santa Gaeta, 10 kilometers beyond Monte San Fratello Scheme 16. The enemy, on whom Truscott had begun to exert heavy pressure from the front, trembled when a landing force from the sea landed in his rear. As a result, the enemy abandoned his position in the mountains and withdrew to create a new line of defense. The 3rd Division, which took the offensive, advanced 20 kilometers towards Messina. It captured 1,500 men and prevented the enemy from making an organized retreat. Success encouraged Patton, and he called me to his forward command post, ordering August 11 to organize a new landing on the north coast. The Germans, knocked out of Monte San Fratello, withdrew in an organized fashion to a new position, entrenched along a ridge of hills behind the Sapolla River with a sandy open channel. After talking with Truscott, I found that his division would not be able to break through this position in time to join up with the landing force on August 11. I asked Patton's permission to postpone the landing to August 12. The landing itself will solve nothing, I insisted, unless it joins Truscott's troops advancing from the front. Now, however, George was anxious to break into Messina. He rejected my request to postpone the landing by a day and insisted on holding it on August 11. I again protested, but George was undeterred. On that day, I left Patton's command post with his directive in a state of irritation such as I had never been in before. I was under Patton's command, and there was nothing more for me to do than to carry out the order. On August 11, just before dawn, the 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, Truscott Division, landed from landing craft near Brola, 20 kilometers in rear of the German position behind the Sapolla River. At first the landing went unnoticed. However, as Truscott's infantry advanced from the coast to the road, a German motorcyclist showed up. A squad of excited riflemen opened fire and the motorcyclist was killed. A few minutes later, rockets flew into the sky. German troops were raised on alert for a counterattack. Nevertheless, by dawn, Truscott's infantry had made its way almost to the top of Monte Creole Mountain, from where the shingled roofs of the houses in Brole were visible. But the self-propelled artillery could not follow the infantry, trapped between the bank and the road in a web of drainage ditches. The 7th Army had failed to provide Truscott with aerial photographs of the terrain before the landing. By noon, under heavy assaults from the front and rear, the infantry on Monte Creole Mountain began to be severely short of ammunition. 13 of the 15 pack mules lay with bloated bellies in the sunlight. 3 hours later, the self-propelled artillery stranded on the beach was covered by fire and attacked by enemy tanks. The battalion was now left on top of the mountain without artillery and had nothing to do but hold the position it had occupied while awaiting the approach of Truscott's main force advancing from the front. It was not until 6 a.m. on August 12 that Truscott's troops joined up with the remnants of the battalion. Truscott had no time left for a bypass maneuver overland, and he launched an assault on the enemy position from the front. Despite these efforts by Truscott, the battalion suffered heavy casualties. Failure, however, did not convert Patton. Despite our successful advance along the North Seaseed Road, he came to the front daily. Such spurring was a characteristic feature in Patton's leadership of the troops. He once confessed that he became a good commander only because he was the most zealous donkey driver in the American Army. Messina was only 65 kilometers away, and Patton's impatience was growing as he sought to break into the city before Montgomery's 8th Army. I also shared Patton's desire. However, I was convinced that we will achieve greater success. Losses will be less if instead of a frontal attack on the coastal positions of the enemy to apply bypass maneuver. By this time, the rapid capture of Messina was no longer important. No matter how fast we attacked the city, we could no longer prevent the enemy to cross the strait into Italy. Commanding the 3rd Army in Europe, George earned the admiration of his soldiers and the love of his subordinate commanders. Patton, however, was a different man in the Mediterranean theatre of war. During this unhappy period of his career, George's acting earned him contempt, and his abruptness led to much resentment among his subordinate commanders. Although George was a skillful actor, however, he failed to understand the psychology of the soldier. A man who has death behind him every day lives in an atmosphere of fear and terror. He begins to treat those who are safe in the rear with reproach. To the soldiers, the army commander is a distant figure who appears at the front from time to time. People judge him by what they see. George annoyed them with his love of making a fuss. He always appeared in a string of staff cars with a retinue of smartly dressed staff officers. Patton's automobile was picturesquely decorated with excessively large stars and the identifying insignia of his army. These trappings, however, did not inspire in the troops the awe that Patton apparently hoped to induce. On the contrary, they provoked indignation in the soldiers who marched in the dust raised by this procession. In Sicily, Patton as a man bore little resemblance to the Patton of whom legends have been formed. On August 10, Patton came to my command post. On the way he stopped near the Corps Evacuation Hospital for the purpose of visiting the wounded. Few commanders have spent more time in hospital wards than George. To him, the soldiers' wounds were a real testament to their courage, and that was what he valued most. These men he understood. He joked and talked to them, shook their hands and pinned the Purple Heart medal on their chests. When George pulled up to the Corps command post, I went out to meet him. He jumped to the ground over the high side of the reconnaissance vehicle. "Sorry I'm late, Bradley," he said. "I got held up at the hospital on my way here. I found a couple of simians there. I hit one of them to get him angry and get his morale up again." He spoke of it carelessly, without embarrassment or any sign of remorse. I would probably have completely forgotten about the incident if I hadn't been reminded of it a couple days later. It was Keane who did it, entering my trailer, accompanied by the corps surgeon. He handed me a piece of paper with typewritten text on it. "I want you to familiarize yourself with this report, General. It was submitted this morning to the corps surgeon by the chief of the 93rd Evacuation Hospital." I read the report and asked the surgeon, "Note, does anyone else know of this document?" "No, sir," he replied, "only me." I handed the document back to Keane. "Is here it in an envelope?" I told him, "and inscribed that the envelope may be opened only by you or by me. Keep it in my safe." The document was a witness statement regarding what later became known as a manhandling incident. It was filed on command by the superintendent of the hospital, where Patton stopped by on his way to the corps. According to the hospital chief, Patton entered the receiving tent of the 93rd Evacuation Hospital without an attendant. He then began to walk around the stretcher, talking to the wounded and congratulating them on the success of their divisions. Finally, he approached a patient who had no bow or bandage. George asked what had happened to him. The latter replied that he was very feverish. George walked away from him without saying a word. Next to him sat another patient who was shaking all over. "What's the matter with you?" Patton asked. "Nerves, sir," replied the patient, and his eyes filled with tears. "What did you say?" George straightened up and asked again. "Nerves, sir," the patient sobbed. "I can't stand being under artillery fire any longer." George raised his voice. "Now to hell with your nerves," he yelled. "You're nothing but a vile coward." The soldier cried, and George slapped him. "Shut up," he said. "I don't want brave soldiers suffering from wounds to look at a cowardly crybaby bastard." George hit him again. The soldier's helmet slipped off his head and rolled across the dirty floor. Patton turned to the officer on duty before receiving the wounded. "Don't admit that cowardly bastard to the hospital. There's decidedly nothing wrong with him. I don't want hospitals filled with sons of bitches afraid of fire." Then, turning to the patient, he said, "Go back to the front line. You may get killed, but only go back there. If you refuse to go back to the front, I will put you against the wall and shoot you." Patton's outburst of anger threw the entire hospital into turmoil. By evening, exaggerated rumors of the incident began to spread across the island. Within a week, everyone knew about the incident at the hospital. Eisenhower also became aware of Patton's manhandling, though not from me. The story finally came to the attention of correspondents assigned to Patton's 7th Army, who quickly relayed the story to the press camp at Allied headquarters in North Africa. Although many of the correspondents were critical of Patton, they were reluctant to send a report of the incident to the newspapers. Patton's behavior was reprehensible, but Eisenhower saw no reason to remove one of the most capable generals in the U.S. Army because of it. He limited himself to reprimanding Patton and ordered him to apologize not only to the wounded and hospital staff, but also to the personnel of the 7th Army. However, rumors of the incident did leak into the United States and sparked a nationwide controversy that nearly cost Patton his career. Eisenhower could have taken advantage of the heated atmosphere to easily get rid of Patton, but he stood up for him. Nevertheless, Patton's action can be understood without condemning him. For George, the war was not so much a test as it was a fulfillment of his duty to which he had devoted his life. He saw war as a chronic affliction of mankind that would exist as long as civilization existed. Since military conflicts were inevitable, George believed that man should reconcile himself to them and, moreover, even welcome them as a courageous challenge. War put him in a cheerful state of mind, and he simply could not understand that a man, short of a coward, would not want to take part in war. At the same time, he could not understand that a man could fail to endure the tremendous mental strain of the hardships of war. It was axiomatic to him that he who does not want to fight is a coward. If you shame a coward, George said, then you can help that person regain respect for himself. I can't believe that George, after calling a soldier a coward, hit him intentionally. George was simply trying to shame the soldier of his cowardice. I have only touched on this incident of manhandling in detail because it had a significant impact on Patton's career later in life. For the rest of his life, George was severely punished for this mistake. He can no longer be blamed for what happened. The admiration with which we regard Patton's memory in Europe is too great for the recollection of this incident, which ultimately made Patton an even better commander, to detract from it. By August 15, it was clear that the end of the campaign in Sicily was only hours away. From Messina across the strait were ferries carrying fleeing Germans. Piles of abandoned war material lay along the coastal road where German troops were retreating. Patton was determined to enter Messina before Montgomery. He therefore ordered a third landing force to be landed behind enemy lines in order to hasten Truscott's advance. This time, he assured me, we had enough landing craft to land an entire regiment. The unexpected good fortune was unfortunately too late. "There is no need to land any more troops," said Truscott. "We can move so fast along the road that the landed troops will be in our rear, and the guns have nothing left to stop us." I mentioned this conversation to Patton, but he wouldn't hear of cancelling the landing. "Very well, General," I said. "Land the troops if you like. We'll meet him on the beach." In the evening of August 15, an infantry regiment of the 45th Division loaded on landing craft with the task of landing in the village of Falcone, 50 kilometres from Messina Chem 16. In the pre-dawn silence of August 16, the regiment landed on the coast. There it was already waiting for our adjusters. Later that day, a battery of 155mm guns, Long Tom, took up a firing position on the coastal road, and the first 100 shells flew across the strait to Italy. By nightfall, Truscott's infantry had reached the point where the northern coastal road turned south toward Messina. From here it was only 20 kilometres to Messina. At 6 o'clock. 30 minutes in the morning of August 17, a platoon of the 3rd Infantry Division cautiously entered the outskirts of Messina. All enemy troops had completely evacuated, leaving an empty city with rubble-filled streets. For months of aerial bombardment were completely destroyed thousands of reinforced concrete buildings of the city, in which 34 years ago, during the earthquake, died under the ruins of 78,000 inhabitants. At 8 o'clock, 25 a.m. Truscott's infantry, along with a patrol from the 45th Division, approached Messina's City Hall. The American troops were only a few minutes ahead of the panting British lieutenant colonel, who came on the road from Catania to declare Montgomery's claim to capture Messina. 2 hours later, Patton and his 7th Army headquarters entered the city. 38 days had passed since our landing in Sicily, and the campaign had ended without much effect. 6 weeks before, aboard the Ancona, I had said in response to questions from reporters that the campaign in Sicily would last 40 days.